BlackBerry maker Research In Motion tanking in the pre-market this morning after missing forecasts. Investors not buying into this idea that the Playbook tablet is going to do well against Apple's iPad. Tavis McCourt is an analyst at Morgan Keegan, joins us on the phone. He's one of the most accurate forecasters on Apple and also RIM, which makes him, of course, a Bloomberg best. And Tavis, I know you've got an outperform on RIM. You haven't changed it. Why not?
It's an exceptionally cheap stock, and I think the risk reward is really compelling for the next year. And look, I don't think it's RIM versus Apple. I have an outperform on Apple too. I think this whole market is expanding extremely rapidly. I think investors make the mistake that RIM needs to somehow sell as many iPads as Apple does to be successful. The reality is RIM needs to be about 1/10 as successful as the iPad for this to be extremely positively meaningful to their bottom line.
Tavis, the other reality is RIM has been a lousy stock. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I was looking back at the Bloomberg records. It looked to me as if you've had an outperform on Research In Motion since September of 2008. That's a period during which RIM has lost half its value, and the S&P has fought its way all the way back to basically be flat. So RIM is certainly not outperforming the market over that stretch. Can you just clarify that?
No, that's accurate. Some stocks go up, some stocks go down. I think what's happened to RIM relative to my expectations was that they've done much better internationally than I would have thought 2 or 3 years ago, and that continues, and much worse in the U.S. And that's what they're trying to fix with the Playbook and their new BlackBerries, and the multiple has a lot to do with how they're doing in the U.S. And
but I think John makes a good point, is that you've had this outperform for several years already on RIM. What would it take to make you change that, though? Because it certainly hasn't lived up to the expectations.
Yeah, look, this would be an easy job if we all just look backwards, but we don't. So I think what it would take is if there was any meaningful change in the international momentum that RIM has, that would be a cause for concern. But I don't see that. 70% of RIM's business is outside of the U.S., and that business is growing nearly 80% year over year. It's hard not to be a growth company when 70% of your business is growing nearly 80% a year. And they have real substantial, sustainable advantages in these markets versus Android and iPhone. But it's very hard to appreciate that if all you do is sit in the U.S., because RIM does not have a lot of advantages in the U.S.
Hey, Tavis, it's Dominic here. RIM is in that unique spot with a couple of these makers, smartphone makers out there, that they make the hardware and they do the software itself. The margins are a huge issue for a lot of these tech companies out there. How does RIM's margin compare with those of Apple and other makers of smartphones out there? Is that something that they can hang their hat on, despite the fact that their market share is declining here?
Yeah, so their market share as a percentage of handsets sold is not declining. Their market share as a percentage of smartphones in the U.S. is. So I want to clarify that. In terms of margins, their margins on their hardware are very similar to a Nokia, a Motorola, and so forth, well below Apple. No one gets anything close to what Apple gets in this business. But the difference is RIM gets recurring revenue on the back end because it carries all the traffic that goes to your BlackBerry. And so they get a nice recurring revenue stream from all the carriers in the world that enable it to operate at higher operating margins than most handset vendors.
Tavis, just really quickly, because you mentioned, this is not an Apple RIM story in your view, but look, BlackBerries, they sold 14.9 million in this latest quarter. Apple sold 16.2 million iPhones in the December quarter. So how many BlackBerries does RIM have to sell now in order to keep it as a growth stock, to justify its premium?
Justify a premium? I'm not looking for a premium. I'm just looking for a reasonable valuation.
What I mean is to justify its growth.
Look, right now RIM's growing year over year 40%. I don't know what investors want from it, but 40% is a pretty good growth rate in most of my years in this business. Right now they're selling 14 to 15 million devices a quarter. That probably has to ramp up by the end of this year to 18 to 20 million.
Okay, Tavis, thank you. Tavis McCourt, a Bloomberg best from Morgan Keegan.